And we are recording. Welcome to today's AgeNet webinar. You may be familiar with our AgeNet series. It's been going for a few years, produced by us at the Center for Research in Public Health and Community Care. We call it CRIPEC at the University of Hertfordshire. Also production of the NIHR Applied Research Collaboration of the East of England. It's great to see so many attendees here this afternoon, coming from, I think, all over the country. It's a lunchtime webinar series, so feel free to grab a bite as you listen to today's presenters. Just a quick notice, as you see, we're being recorded, and we'll distribute that recording later by email. So we have about 2 AgeNet webinars per year, each one putting a spotlight on a different theme in aging-related research. Recent webinars have focused on digital technologies for adult social care and how public engagement is making a difference in aging research. Today's theme is about dementia-focused research, specifically the role of community groups and public spaces in the experience of dementia. It's a growing area of both policy and research around the world, and especially here in the UK, where new focus on integrated care systems has raised questions around broader community support as well. It's a really varied area of research. My research focuses on dementia-friendly initiatives, and within that, we'll often refer to like the 3 Ps framework, which captures the breadth of the topic. The 3 Ps really standing for people, place, and process, with people referring to awareness and training around dementia, place referring to natural and built environments, and process referring to policies and organizational structures. And so I'm really pleased that all 3 of those Ps are covered in one way or another by our presenters today. And I'm really pleased to welcome them now. We have Dr. Stephen Owen from the University of Hertfordshire here. We have Professor Jane Cross from the University of East Anglia, and Professor Richard Ward from University of Stirling up in Scotland. Each presenter will speak for about 20 minutes. They'll speak in succession, just one right after the other, and we'll hold questions until the very end. So the last half hour, I'll moderate a discussion that's led by your questions. So as questions come to you during their talks, please feel free to type them in the chat at any time. If you have a question that somebody else has already asked in the chat, feel free to give them a thumbs up or some kind of reaction so that we can know which questions are most in demand. First up we have Steve Owen. Steve joined the University of Hertfordshire last year, 2024, as a research fellow. Prior to that, he was working as a research fellow at the University of Exeter on a project called Enliven, which he'll be talking about today. Steve comes from a geography background with an interest in supporting older people with dementia to live well in the community. So take it away, Steve.
Okay. Okay, well, thanks for that introduction, Greg. And as today I'm going to be talking about mainly the natural environment and nature in relation to people living with dementia. And so my presentation is the board structure. I'll start with a bit of background about why this is important. Then introduce the Enliven study, which came to a close last year. And then I talk about one aspect of that project, where we look at how people living with dementia in the community engage with nature in their everyday lives and what this means to them. So as a bit of background, there's 944,000 people in the UK who live with dementia. This is predicted to reach 1.1 million by 2030. And 4 out of 5 people with dementia actually live in the community, and they're eager mostly to actually carry on with their lives and continue to have a normal lives regardless of their condition. In terms of the policy landscape, there's been a shift from like a medical approach to dementia, where we look at it's like a problem to do with the person, to more a social model, where we look at what are the barriers that society is creating that's stopping people living with dementia to actually live meaningful lives or to live well with dementia. And so this approach recognizes that for people with dementia to lead fulfilling lives, we have to have an inclusive society where they can actually do what they're able to do or support to do the best possible. And this includes the opportunity to access the natural environment. So when people often think about dementia, this kind of image comes to people's mind where they perhaps look at someone thinking about they're worried or concerned. Indeed, when I Googled dementia, these photos were some of the first that came up, with someone sitting inside. Like, we know that this is not how the majority of people who live with dementia actually live their lives, or most importantly, how they actually want to live their lives. So it's really important to understand that what people living with dementia actually do in nature, in their everyday lives, what they would like to do, and what are some of the barriers that might be stopping them from able to get out as much as they would like. And this kind of set the background for the Enliven study, which the long term is extending active life for older people with cognitive impairment through innovation in visitor economy of the natural environment. It's quite a mouthful. It was a 3-year program running from March 21 to February 24, based at the University of Exeter, funded by the UKRI. It was in collaboration with Brunel, Hertfordshire, Manchester, and Bradford universities, and third sector organisations such as Innovations in Dementia and the Century Trust. Importantly, there's an advisory group of people living with cognitive impairment and people who support or had supported someone living with cognitive impairment were involved throughout the entire duration of the project. And yeah, Enliven was one of 7 research projects funded by the UKRI that formed the Healthy Aging Social Behavioural and Design Research Programme overseen by the ESRC. Just a quick acknowledgement of my former colleagues who I worked with. You can see it was quite a big team that we had on the project. Yeah, a special shout out to Professors Claire, Connell and Page, who actually really led the project. And not included in this are the advisory group members who are really keen throughout the whole project in really shaping and steering the way the project developed. So in terms of the aim of Enliven, it was to make the wellbeing benefits of outdoor activity more accessible to older people living with cognitive impairment. What we did, we explored where people with cognitive impairment like to go in nature, what they like to do there, and the challenge they experience. We also looked at what challenges and opportunities outdoor nature providers perceived in making their sites accessible to people living with cognitive impairment. And finally, using this information, we co-created and offered seed funding for innovative pilot projects supporting access to nature for people with cognitive impairment and their families. And yeah, just throughout all the stages, really it was the voices of people living with dementia which shaped all of these objectives and how we carried this out. So in terms of what we did, we conducted literature searches. So we did a scope and review of publishing grey literature to actually really understand what is currently out there. We conducted interviews with people with dementia and their family members, with businesses. We went on site audits to go around sites and seeing how accessible they might be for someone living with dementia. And we also went to these sites with people living with dementia and someone who's supporting them, perhaps a family member, just seeing how they navigated the site. So it's really interesting then to see how much, as a researcher, you wouldn't notice how many people, when people have lived experience, how you really see the things that they noticed. A lot of people wouldn't, and the real value of using such people to assess the accessibility of places. We also had participant observation. So during the pilot projects, we documented the reactions of participants. And then, yeah, we had the advisory group, which was involved in all stages of the project, and a knowledge exchange forum, bringing together businesses and stakeholders to develop pilot projects. It was very much a co-construction throughout the whole of the project. Just quickly mention, my former colleagues will be publishing more on this, but we've published 4 papers so far. The first is the scoping review, which sets out kind of the background of what is actually known at the present time when we started. There's a paper by Professor Page from the University of Hertfordshire, who looked at the how and why tourism businesses look to become dementia friendly. And then Dr. Stapley, as well, who's now at University of Hertfordshire, gives us some of the preferences and barriers experienced by people living with dementia when they get out into nature. And finally, my paper, which is the embodied leisure experiences of nature-based activities for people with dementia. And this is mainly the evidence I'll be drawing on today. I'll just quickly mention the other outputs we had from the project. We had a guide for businesses, practical tips for businesses in relation to being dementia friendly, a policy briefing, short films from Enliven, and recordings of presentations from a knowledge exchange event. So if anyone's interested, these are all available on the Enliven website, which is the link below. So the question I want to look at today is, what do people living with dementia do in nature, and how do they connect, construct meaning, and drive value from nature? So if we looked at the evidence base, there's growing evidence of the benefits of nature with potential to reduce depression and anxiety for people, some evidence of improving cognitive function, mood, and overall quality of life. But when we looked at these studies, most of these people are studies that conducted with people living in residential care or attending care facilities such as green care farms. Others have like organized group activities, which are facilitated by trained staff, typically focusing on therapeutic gardening, animal-assisted therapy, walking and urban woodland activity programs. But the thing is, we know that many people who live in the community do not actually participate in such formalized activity. And if they do, it may only be like a small percentage of the time that they spend throughout the week. So we really want to know how people with dementia living in the community engage with nature in their everyday lives. Just a quick mention of how we went about this. We recruited participants through the online portal, Joint Dementia Research, partner organizations, and some existing contacts we had. I recruited 15 people who were living with dementia and 15 family members or supporters of someone with dementia. All interviews were conducted between November 21 and March 22 by telephone or video call, as there's still some COVID restrictions at the time. And we used an interview schedule, which was developed with the advisory group. So it was really focused on what they thought was really important to know. And then we could ask the questions in a way that they thought people would understand. And the real focus was on nature, the outdoors, and leisure experiences. And during the interview, we incorporated photographs. So we'd show photos of older people engaging in different activities. And we'd ask people if they would like to do that activity or do they do it, and then why. And we found these photos quite a useful way of just kind of steering the conversation and encouraging people to talk about their preferences and experiences. So one of the first things that came up when we looked at what we found out was a real diversity of the types of things people do and really what they wanted to do. So some people went to really active pursuits, such as walking and gardening, or some swimming and sailing. Others were less active, like watching wildlife, looking at coastal views. Some people were happy to participate in groups for people with dementia, while others avoided such groups as something they kind of didn't want to be associated with. Some people preferred the solitude in nature, found it really good for connection to themselves and the environment, whilst others looked for the opportunity to connect with others. And like when some were interested in the novelty of trying new pursuits, others preferred the familiarity of what they knew. So yeah, we can really see the real diversity in what people with dementia like to do, but also how these preferences, even with the same person, can change over time. So it's really important. We had a mantra that once you met one person with dementia, you met one person with dementia. And so I think that's really important when you try to think about anything to do with dementia, is that there's so much variation in what people want and to do. There were some limitations when people talk about the activities they like to do and kind of got in the way of that. Often limitations stem not from dementia itself, but from other comorbidities that impacted physical health. Many people had mobility issues or sensory issues that actually kind of limited what they could do in nature. And then participants described how to adapt to reflect what was available to them and their capabilities. So some people, for example, one gentleman who used to be able to go fishing, but then was able to go, but he had to have like a special type of board and things. And so yeah, there's some were able to do those adaptations, but yeah, some people it was more difficult. So while some express real disappointment or kind of loss of what they could do, often there's people just expressing the real appreciation from what they were able to do. And some even said that since dementia, they actually spent more time going outside because they really saw it as beneficial to their health. And also, they just really felt like they needed to take the time and really appreciate what they could do. So there's real, yeah, so really quite inspiring the way people, how much people really enjoyed being outside into nature. And so when I was looking at the themes to try to develop these, it looked there's three that really jumped out to me that I'll quickly go through. And there's like the body feelings and emotions, the sense of self and identity, and connectivity to others. So what really stood out is how people or sense of being was affected by being in nature. So sensuous experiences of nature that resonate throughout the body, and it's common feelings of enjoyment, rejuvenation, mindfulness, the real focus of being in the moment came through quite a lot of the interviews. And this appreciation of connecting to nature at a deeply personal level. Although it must be recognized that some participants have to limit their time in nature due to negative bodily sensations. Many noted how since experiencing dementia, the wind became more disorientating, whilst others felt the effect of being cold and wet more than they used to, which often reflected other ailments such as using blood thinners, which meant them feel the cold more. I included this quote from Peter, which kind of summarizes this kind of section. And he says, it's just so relaxing. It's the open, fresh air I love. To me, it's hearing the birds, and then you've got the smells. When people say to me, it's raining, what are you doing going out? I just got to feel the rain on my face and the wind. It makes me feel alive. So this quote really shows how people describe the real cornucopia of kind of feelings and sensations throughout the whole body and the senses of being in nature and the importance of just being there. Also important was like the sense of self and identity. So often people had lifelong associations with specific nature pursuits, which often framed common preferences. So someone had always go and say fishing is that ability to carry on doing this was really important for their sense of self. Also, those familiar places could instigate feelings of happiness that resonated throughout the body. Many people described their family members, how they were just like you could tell by the way their whole body moved, how different they were when they were doing something familiar on a familiar place. And there's a deep emotional connections that resonate through the body, irrespective of any cognitive or communicative difficulties a person may be experiencing. And quite a few people said how they could see the way the person they were caring for or supported change so much when they're doing something they were familiar with, which kind of shows how a sense of memory resided within the body, even if someone wasn't able to communicate it, or cognitively perhaps then more difficulties remembering why they knew this. So yeah, so the way the self identity can reside within the body was quite a big thing that came out. A couple of quotes I got from Peter said, it's either going back to what you're doing or just sitting staring at the walls all day. I'd rather get out. So Peter really demonstrates how there's this really desire to make the most of every opportunity to just try to live as independently and have a meaningful life. And Amelia described going with her husband, how going back to this place anytime just completely transforms him. I just by going back to a place that he had such a connection with and such an important part of his life, yeah, she described how he'd walk faster and his whole body would transform. And the final theme that really emerged is how being in nature facilitated enhanced connection to others, be this through deep or fleeting conversations. So many people described how being out in nature, they actually talked about deeper things and meaningful things than they would have talked about at home. And whilst some just appreciate the fleeting conversations, so one gentleman would always go on his daily walk and just saying hello to people as they walk past was just a real way of just being connected to different people of the community. There were some people who, well, quite a few who said they had aversion to going somewhere new unless accompanied by someone to provide reassurance. So this was quite common with people Often lack of confidence meant they weren't sure about going somewhere by themselves, or they were worried about wayfinding, or perhaps falling over. And so many did prefer to go with someone else. And that this reliance on others did sometimes prevent people from fully engaging in what they like to do. Some described concerns of being a burden, where someone was worried that people would have to drive him places. Or one lady said she had to stop going to walking groups because no one said stopped her, but just she felt like she was slowing everyone else down. And this kind of feeling not want to bother other people stopped her. And so, yeah, how many people may be perceived by others. So one gentleman described how he'd only play golf with people he knew because he'd be worried if he made a mistake, other people wouldn't understand. And although all the people with dementia were really grateful for like the support they had or family or friends, they did know that sometimes they were overly cautious and they tried to stop them from engaging in some activities due to the perceived risk, which they felt that was too controlling, a kind of a loss of self of autonomy of what they wanted to do in nature. In terms of these couple of quotes I had, Paul was saying it's nice to not only to see nature, it's good to talk about it as well. So Paul really brings to life how very aspect of the shared experience is what really for him brought nature to life. And that is quite common about this kind of increased social ability that happened in nature. And Calvin said how they were all very protective. Like they were following me around the campsite, stuff like that. And I had to say, what are you doing? And then they got the message and just led me to it. So this was a few people did mention these sort of things where people felt like, yeah, by being overprotective, people were unable to actually enjoy the experience. And so it's finding that balance of just being supportive and encouraging people to do things. And that was quite an issue that a lot of people struggle to find. So what does this all mean? Really, we found that people living with dementia can and do engage with nature in rewarding, pleasurable, and stimulating ways in their everyday lives. Sometimes they can't do what they used to, but through being able to do what they can, they really found this enjoyable. And so it's important to foster an environment in which people are supported to engage in nature in the ways that they want. So it's not we want to recognize that diversity in personal characteristics and lived experiences shape engagement with one size not fitting all. So it's important to not make assumptions about what people living with dementia can or want to do. It's important to actually listen to them and try to make places as accessible as possible. And so essential for this is the voices of people with dementia should be central when decisions are being made, accessing and using natural spaces. So that's throughout this project, we kept on trying to put the voices of people with dementia at the center. And that's the really way that we have to do on a wider scale if we want people to access natural spaces, is actually listening and making sure that it's not an afterthought, but really central to actually what they want from these spaces and how they want to use them. And finally, we need to reframe nature for people with dementia away from association with care or therapy to one of individual autonomy. So although things like animal interventions and care farms are actually really valuable, they make a difference, we can't forget about the importance of nature for giving people a sense of meaning, fulfillment, and it's a challenge. And all these important things that make people life worth living. So it's really important that we kind of focus on that and try to find out how we can make a society that actually supports this. And this is what the rest of the Alignment Project kind of went on to do. But yeah, I haven't really got time to speak about that today. But thank you for listening.
Thanks very much, Steve. Really, really interesting stuff on the role of nature and activities in nature for people living with dementia. Just a reminder, everybody, we are saving questions for the most part until the end, but I wonder, Steve, if you wouldn't mind answering a quick question that Sue had in the chat around green care farms. You know, that was part of the activities that people were doing. You were studying. If you could just give a quick description of green care farm.
Okay, well, yeah, that wasn't actually what we were studying. That was kind of what people have actually done research on, where people bring perhaps someone with dementia to a place perhaps for a day, and they can like look after the animals and do things like that, and then come back. So it's very much a care setting that's organized and facilitated, and there's some real benefits from that from the literature. But yeah, so we were kind of we didn't actually study that. We were looking more about what people did in their everyday.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Steve. Okay. Next up, we have Professor Jane Cross presenting on social prescribing. So Jane Cross is a professor of health services research at the University of East Anglia with an interest in developing and testing complex interventions for people with long-term conditions. She's currently leading 2 NIHR programs with Professor Chris Fox, developing interventions to improve care for people with dementia and their families. But today she's going to focus on the Splendid Project, which is starting its 2nd year developing a pathway for people with dementia to have equal opportunity and access to social prescribing. This pathway will be implemented and tested across England and the devolved nations as well. So take it away, Jane.
Thanks, Greg. I'll just share my screen with everyone. Perhaps, Greg, you could give me a thumbs up if it's there.
I see it.
Perfect, thank you. So thank you everybody for coming along and listening today. And I'm going to pick up a few of the themes that Steve's brought out in his first presentation are going to come and feature in here as well. As Greg has so nicely said, Chris and I are leading the Splendid Project, which is NIHR funded program grant. Basically that means it takes an awfully long time to do anything because there's so many stages in it. But our ambition is to give people with dementia equal access and opportunity to benefit from social prescribing. And I can see I've got one social prescriber most definitely here today because she's got it next to her name. So I've noticed that one. But it'd be interesting to hear from others of you that are perhaps involved in social prescribing. Oh, hang on. I just need to move my mouse just to, there we are. So same background as Greg, basically. Dementia is a big problem. It's a getting bigger problem. And we want to try and demedicalize it as much as possible because at the moment there's little that medical science can do to change what's going on with dementia. So our ambition is to make living with dementia a more enjoyable experience for as long as possible, and those two things kind of go together. So we're looking at can people with dementia be offered tailored interventions and lifestyle approaches here, and we are particularly focusing on social prescribing. The reason for doing that is one of the reasons for doing this is that post-diagnostic support for people with dementia is very varied. It's varied in both the sorts of post-diagnostic support, and it's varied in what its availability is like. And significantly, sometimes there is no post-diagnostic support, and sometimes there is extensive diagnostic support. It very much depends on where you are, where you live, what services you've got, etc. We came on this journey with Splendid. We started, it takes an awfully long time to get these things going. And so one of the issues with doing these big projects is the world keeps constantly changing underneath your feet. And one of the things I very freely acknowledge is that this changing world under your feet really impacts on the kind of research you're doing and how you're doing it. And so some of that I hope you might see in my presentation. What is social prescribing? Well, for those of you that aren't involved in social prescribing, this is a picture of what social prescribing is intended to do and how it's intended to work. This comes from a reasonably recent publication from somebody called Muhl, M-U-H-L, and it maps what goes on in social prescribing. This has particularly been used to come up with what is now an international definition for social prescribing. And what we're looking for is social prescribing that fits this definition. So we're particularly working with this definition in the project. So there is an identifier who identifies that the person has non-medical needs that could benefit from social prescribing. And then they refer them, or the person can refer themselves to a connector who is often called a social prescriber in primary care settings. And if people want to ask me more about why I'm specifying that, I can tell you more about that later. And then that connector works with the person with dementia or otherwise to co-produce a prescription for something that is non-medical that might help them feel and enjoy their life better. That process is a kind of a revolving door type process, in that the person who wants the social prescribing could be seeing the social prescriber a number of times, and they may try various interventions of social prescribing and not enjoy them and come back. So it should have that facility of trying something and then reviewing it and coming back. And at the end of it, what you hope is that you improve their health, their well-being, and that you strengthen their community connections, which can address loneliness and disassociation from society. So I think I've probably covered this. Just to also add, we have a very strong theme through the programme of embedding people with dementia throughout the programme. Lots of researchers say that. We all say that because we have to say that as part of the process. But we have worked really hard with our service users, particularly the people with dementia. We're listening to their supporters, the people who help care for them as well, but we're particularly focusing on what the people with dementia tell us about what they want. We've got an overarching diversity theme throughout the programme, because one of the big issues here is diversity of the population, but also diversity of the socioeconomic factors and other living factors that there are, rurality versus urban living, for example, which greatly impact on social prescribing opportunities. We are involving people with dementia throughout the design process as well as others, and then we will be following this up with a pretty large clinical trial, which is going to be very testing for us. This is the design part of the developing the pathway process. So we've got a number of things going on in the design. We have done some work to map what social prescribing provision is like, what the barriers might be to delivery, so that we can think about what we need in the social prescribing pathway. We have a part of the work package that involves all the stakeholders in this process in refining and helping us co-design what the care pathway looks like. We have another strand of work which is looking at what might be appropriate and valid social prescribing outcomes for people living with dementia. And then we have, we also added what is called a complex intervention systematic review. So this is a systematic review with a bit of bells and whistles on it that allows you to include much more evidence so that you get a better picture of the overarching state of the knowledge. And what we've done from that is we've looked at the mechanisms of social prescribing for people living with dementia. And we're currently sitting in work package 1D, which is the splendid optimization bit, which is now we've got an idea of what this pathway needs to look like, and what we're doing is working with our stakeholders in various groups to refine and adapt the pathway to something that we hope is implementable in the context, because obviously if you can't implement something in the context, you can't test it in any sort of trial. So where have we been? Well, we've been over most parts of the UK, as you can see. These are the kind of the red dots. And across the UK, we interviewed a number of social prescribers. We've interviewed people with dementia. We've interviewed the supporters, the carers of people with dementia. We have also interviewed GPs, nurses, and we are currently desperately seeking commissioners who will take part in this process, and that's proving quite elusive. So if anyone's got any ideas of a nice tame commissioner, that would be great. So we have been across lots of different parts of the UK. So now I'm going to introduce you to some of the insights that we've gained from some of this. So social prescribers, well, what do? Well, they try to offer person-centered tailored support. That might be in one or more sessions. They can signpost to a wide variety of areas, and they try to set achievable goals with the person. But that is a general thing. There's lots and lots of difference here. And one of my biggest learning points across this whole project is just how different it is in different parts of the country, even as much as different parts of the same ICB, different surgeries are doing it differently. So where and how they meet, whether they meet face to face, whether they talk on the phone, whether they go to the person's home, whether they meet in the GP surgery, whether they meet in a community setting. How long they can support people with dementia for. This is becoming more and more prescribed by the organisation that they're working in, and that is causing social prescribers issues, shall we say. The types of activities they can do with the person, accompanying them to activities, doing activities in the home, helping them with form filling, social support, emotional support. That's all very variable across the sample that we talk to. Setting up new activities, all very variable. Some of them have specialist skills and specialist backgrounds, some don't. Loads of difference in the sort of people who are working as social prescribers. And also there's a difference in whether they will or won't accept self-referrals. Now, when I say they, please don't assume that I mean the individual social prescribers. That's not what I mean. What I'm talking about is the context within which they work. So it's their organisations and the way in which they work. And you've had chance, I hope, to read the little quotes, which I'm trying to include on every slide. Most social prescribing is generic. So social prescribers describe themselves not as specialists, but as jack of all trades. But there are some tailored social prescribing services. Some people particularly focus on young people, older adults, mental health, veterans. But the dementia specialists are very, very few and far between. Some social prescribers end up with a kind of unofficial specialism, and that can mean that sometimes they're a point of reference for others who come to them for further information about it. Our third insight is that there really isn't any more planning to be more specialist about dementia. There's an increasing workforce in social prescribing, but there's really high demand, and social prescribers are really struggling to manage the demand against the expectations of the service, particularly if the service is setting itself up to deliver according to the international definition. That's causing an enormous amount of tension for social prescribers. There is a drive coming from primary care to cut back on the face-to-face time with the person who's receiving social prescribing. That's partly due to the high demand. It's partly due to the fact that GP practices are their own businesses. So there is a pressure on space and there's a pressure on resource. All of that is really impacting on how social prescribers can and will deliver their services. They want to accept self-referrals, but self-referrals are tricky. So thinking about how you onboard people into sort of social prescribing services is a really particular focus. Then we thought about, well, what proportion of social prescribing services offer services to people living with dementia? Everyone offered social prescribing to all adults. But there's very mixed experiences of how many people living with dementia are accessing social prescribing. And I can talk more about that because a lot of what's happening is such a complex situation, because it's not just about what social prescribers want to do or what social prescribing is, but it's about social prescribing within primary care, which is so complicated. And they're ending up seeing people with dementia at specific time points within their journey, and that's making social prescribing function differently within the context of the setting. And some social prescribers went as far as to say that in their experiences, social prescribing was much more appropriate for the carer or the supporter of the person with dementia than it was actually for the person with dementia. And this really was highlighted quite frequently by a lot of the social prescribers we talked to. And we sort of categorized their feelings according to these particular themes here. So firstly, there was quite an expectation. There was quite a feeling that working with people with dementia was a bit scary. The social prescribers didn't feel well enough prepared. They didn't understand the dementia well enough. And I think they're nervous about that particular thing. And therefore, they are often reliant on the support of the carer who's with them. They want to work with the carer. They think that by working through the carer, they can provide the service, and that sometimes it is actually about supporting the carer more than it is about supporting with the person with dementia. And quite a number of social prescribers felt that it was quite a specialist role. And again, that's why I need to go back to the context of our work, which is this is about primary care social prescribing and not about the sort of social prescribing that you might see in more specialist organisations, which are also embracing this sort of community-based intervention approach to help people live with dementia. The last thing that the last insight I want to draw your attention to here is what social prescribers said they needed in order to work better with people with dementia. They wanted to increase their knowledge of dementia itself. They were particularly wanting to understand what happens to memory, what happens to the person's ability to engage, what happens with challenging behaviour, what happens when, if and when someone with dementia denies their diagnosis. They wanted to be able to address people's fears of attending events and activities. On the other hand, at the same time, they felt that there was probably a lack of activities that they can send people with dementia out to as the social prescription, and that was quite challenging. They had experiences of those services refusing to have people with dementia in their groups, which again they found very challenging. And also they found that the carer, the supporter of the person with dementia, was often required to attend the activity. And quite often that was in counterpoint to the social prescriber perceiving that the carer perhaps needed a bit of time off during that interaction in the activity. And then there are the perennial issues of transport and funding, which I don't think any service doesn't experience. But of course, depending again, it goes back to that thing about rurality and versus urban. You know, if you live in rural East Anglia, as many of you will know, getting anywhere might rely on a bus once a week. It's a big challenge to get anywhere if you haven't got your own transport. And then obviously there's the funding issues. We've got lots of areas of socioeconomic deprivation across the country, but particularly in the east of England. So again, big issues here for how social prescribing might work. All of this is very much in counterpoint to what the people with dementia tell us they want. And there's a very, very strong, clear message coming from the people with dementia. They want access to all types of social prescribing, and they want to be allowed to go independently, not just with their supporter or their family member or their carer. And that comes through so strongly in all our PPI activities. Balancing that against everything you've just heard from the other side of the argument, you can see is going to be quite challenging. So what are we doing next? Well, we're a long way through designing our social prescribing pathway, remembering that what we're trying to do is put a pathway in place that in primary care facilitates the person with a new diagnosis of dementia to access social prescribing services in a particular way that fits with the international definition of what social prescribing should look like. That pathway is in parts not that complicated, but in parts it's very complicated, and it's often very complicated because of the context within which we're trying to work, which is this primary care scenario where your GP practices are all acting as independent businesses, delivering services in the way that they decide, given the overarching parameters of the primary care network, NHSE, etc. So it's quite complicated putting all that lot together. Once we have our pathway, what we're going to do is we're going to run our feasibility study. And our feasibility study, we plan to operate in those particular regions that you can see on the map. And what we're going to do is recruit a couple of practices in each of those areas, and we're going to try out the pathway there. It'll be both a feasibility study from the perspective of running a clinical trial, which is where you look at, can you recruit the participants? Can you bring them into a trial? Can you keep them in a trial? Can you collect the right outcomes? Are the outcome measures easy to use? Those are all the clinical trial perspectives. But at the same time, we're also going to be looking at, can we actually deliver this pathway? And we're going to run this as an implementation study. So we're looking at, can we implement it into the context? Can the people operate it in the context? Does it behave in the context as we imagined it would when we put it together? So there's a number of facets to the next stage of the work. Once we've learned from that, then the pathway should then move into the final stage, which would be to test it in a randomized control trial, which I think is going to be just immensely challenging. My reflections on the last 18 months or so that I've been doing this is that I've never tried to operate as a researcher in such a complex area where there are so many confounding things going on. So that's our next steps. And I'd like to, of course, acknowledge all the people that I work with on this. This is a huge program of work, and you can see there's an awful lot of universities and others involved. I noticed a couple of comments about various things about the charities, and as you can see, the charities here, Alzheimer's Society, Together in Dementia Every Day, and DEEP are all very integrated into this project and inputting. I should also add that the National Association of Social Prescribing and the Social Prescribing Networks are also really involved in this project. So we are really embedding it with a huge variety of stakeholders. And I thank you very much for listening and hope that's interesting.
Thank you, Jane. Clearly very interesting. We've had a lot of lively chat in the comments section. As you're speaking, I'm impressed you caught some of them. It's worth a look for everybody. Some good engagement on social prescribing and just such a relevant, very timely project for the whole country. And some questions raised as well, of course, that we'll get to after our next presentation, which will be from Richard Ward. Richard Ward's a professor of dementia studies in the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Stirling. His research interests include social care practice, the experience of living with dementia, and how place-based experience can influence the lives of people with chronic and progressive conditions more broadly. He's also the co-founder of the Critical Dementia Studies Network. So thank you very much. Take it away, Richard.
Thank you very much, Greg. I'm just going to move this onto a slideshow if I can. Hopefully you can see that okay. Okay.
Yes, we can see it.
You can, great, thank you. And thanks, Greg, and to your team for inviting me along today to present, and for everyone for coming along, for your time listening to the presentations. What I'd like to do in this presentation is reflect a little bit on the opportunities, but also the ongoing challenges of growing or enhancing dementia inclusivity in a kind of community environment. Work out how to move my slides a bit. So I'm going to draw in a very unscientific and highly selective way on a range of research experiences that I've been involved in on and off for the last sort of 15 years or so all of which have had a kind of a shared focus around what it's like living with dementia on a day-to-day basis in a community environment. And it was research that began with a fairly small scale pilot project involving about a dozen or so carers of people with dementia. We scaled it up into a work package as part of a large program on neighborhoods and dementia, and that's particularly where the learning and the data I'm going to share with you today comes from. It was also part of a Sterling-based community development project where we were beginning to learn the many challenges of trying to translate research experiences into changes in communities. And then most recently, I'm leading this project called Enact Dem, where we're collaborating with colleagues in Germany and Canada to really explore some of the different experiences across different kinds of settings and situations. So I wanted to start with this idea of a shrinking world, because when we began our research, well over 10 years ago now, there was almost no research into just what it's like living with dementia day to day in a community. But there were a handful of studies that were beginning to kind of orient towards this idea of a shrinking world. And essentially what they were arguing is that following a diagnosis of dementia, people's worlds begin to constrict, and both socially and physically around them. And more recent research has really begun to kind of flesh out what is happening and add a bit of detail and nuance, and even trying to quantify the extent that this happens for people. And three key features of this is that people tend to have a reduced distance that they're traveling and less coverage of the neighborhoods and communities that they live in. They also visit a more and more limited range of destinations within the areas that they live, and quite often are swapping out visiting leisure or commercial or social destinations for more of an emphasis on healthcare interactions. And also hand in hand with this, of course, is that people have fewer social opportunities, fewer social activities, and as a consequence of that, a reduced frequency and duration of social interaction. And I'm starting with this because it's probably the most well-evidenced, robust finding that you can come across around a shared experience of people with dementia living in a community environment. It's been reported repeatedly over at least a decade from studies in many different parts of the world using a whole variety of different methodologies, and they all seem to arrive at this issue. And it's important because it really impacts on people's trajectory with dementia. It really influences the journey. It heightens people's risk of being socially isolated, being confined at home. It heightens the risk of untimely admission to long-term care. And of course, it also puts immense pressures on family carers and the networks that they rely on, the support networks they rely on. And one of the reasons that I wanted to highlight it is because the shrinking world issue spotlights two really key issues, one of which is the importance, but also the changing social relationship that people have with their social networks. And the other is the importance of access to outdoor and public spaces and the way that begins to change following a diagnosis of dementia. So let's just begin with some of what we learned from social about social networks. We used a really basic form of social network mapping, just handing people a pen and paper really, and saying to them, tell us who is the most important people in your lives right now. And even though it was very basic, it was really fruitful as an approach, because it allowed the people that we were talking to really visualize the support network that was around them, the kind of social connections. And it allowed us as interviewers to really kind of focus and ask, quite pinpoint these issues around who and where and how often and how frequently and what kind of support you get and that kind of thing. One of the key things that we learned was that kind of social loss that was identified under the shrinking world phenomenon. Happens very quickly on the back of somebody receiving a diagnosis of dementia. And I would argue that really is telling us that social losses aren't about somebody withdrawing because of struggles with their condition. It's much more about issues of stigma, avoidance, social discomfort around dementia that people are encountering in their day-to-day lives. What this meant was that, from the point of view of people with dementia, there was a huge emphasis on needing to kind of push back at these social losses. So they were in a position of really having to fight to hold on to the remaining connections that they had, but also to kind of rebuild their social networks and the social connections that they had in their lives. And that was a real primary focus of people's time and concerns following on from a diagnosis. And a lot of the people that we spoke to put an emphasis on kind of reciprocity in these social networks. So people with dementia were really keen for us to understand that they weren't just passively receiving help. They were out there, they were giving help to other people, they were being a support to the people around them as part of their network, as part of this kind of give and take transactional relationship that they were part of. The other thing about the network mapping was that it was a really nice opportunity just to say to people, okay, what for you, who are the most important people to you in your lives right now? What is the kind of support that you most value, and what has been most impactful in terms of your abilities to live in day-to-day life following your diagnosis? And a really eye-opening finding from these maps was actually there were almost no formal dementia practitioners who actually made it onto these maps. No social workers, no OTs, no psychologists, consultant gerontologists. I think there was one CPN that got mentioned, and then a smattering of third sector workers, particularly people who were facilitating social groups and community groups and that kind of thing. Instead, the focus was really squarely on family, on friends, on neighbours, and those kind of local figures in the community who had shown kind of understanding and had been supportive towards a person with dementia. And when we asked people what has been the most impactful, the most valuable kind of support that you've received, because people were giving and receiving lots of different kinds of support. Overwhelmingly, both carers and people with dementia talked about peer support. And for some people with dementia, they really emphasized that it had been a transformative experience for them. So not only transforming their conception of dementia, but also transforming their own self-perception of a person with dementia and what that actually meant. So what we were learning from these interviews was really that people with dementia themselves are right at the heart of dementia inclusion. You know, they're really doing the kind of legwork in terms of creating these kind of supportive environments within the community. But alongside the network mapping, we also used walking interviews, which are really nice methods. I think Steve was talking a little bit about it in his presentation. If you've not tried them, I'd really recommend that you give them a go, particularly if you're doing work with people with dementia, because the nice thing about a walking interview is that the person with dementia leads that interaction. They decide where you go, they decide how long you walk for, they decide what pace you walk at, and they're effectively giving you a guide to an area that's familiar to them. But there's something really nice about walking side by side with someone when you're trying to ask them questions. It's a lot less pressurized than the kind of face-to-face kind of traditional interview style that some people with dementia find quite hard. But one of the insights that came out of these walking interviews was that they revealed a whole other layer of social connection in people's communities that we hadn't really been able to kind of make visible on the social network maps. And kind of walking around people's communities in real time, what we were seeing were all these kind of sometimes quite brief kind of interactions, stopping, saying hello to a friend, saying hello to a neighbor, going into a shop, you know, the shopkeeper, you talk to them, going to a cafe, talking to the person behind the counter at the cafe. But also people talked to us about all the little kind of moments of support that were built into these journeys that they were taking. So, for example, a particular optician who was really skilled at helping someone with dementia to get the right prescription for their glasses, which is often quite a challenging task. A supermarket worker that walked somebody outside the front of the supermarket and then pointed them in the direction to get home, because they sometimes felt quite disoriented when they came out of shops. The hairdresser who phoned someone half an hour before their appointment because they knew that otherwise they might forget their appointment. So there were all these little moments of what we kind of called small acts of social care that on their own individually were quite unremarkable. But when you start seeing them collectively and seeing them cumulatively as somebody is moving around their neighborhood, you begin to realize that they're a really important part of the support that people with dementia receive within their community. And in particular, not only kind of supporting people to stay independent, but really kind of shoring up a sense of belonging and that kind of connection and attachment to the places that they live. And I think for us, one of the things that it underlined is that really interlocking relationship between place and people, because the more that people were able to get out and about in public spaces, the more they were able to benefit from these kind of collective encounters that they were involved in along the way. But another aspect of the walking interviews is that we were able to look at people's relationships with places and spaces as well. And we certainly soon began to identify patterns of where people would gravitate to and then the places that they would avoid and why. I think one of the things was the pace and tempo of different kinds of environments were a big factor in what felt comfortable and what felt less comfortable for people. So I think one of the attractions of green and open spaces was that people could go at their own pace and at their own speed and really engage with an environment without feeling pressured to move about and perform tasks at a particular speed. But we also saw the benefits of moving from place to place. So much like the benefits of encountering different people and how they offer different kinds of places, offer different kinds of benefits. So connection with nature on a walk in green space or blue space, but then also that sense of achievement when you've managed to get the bus to the local shopping mall and you're doing shopping without being accompanied by a carer, and that sense of independence that comes out of that. So there was a kind of cumulative significance moving between different places. And much like the work that people were doing really to hold on to their social connections, people also talked about the work that they were doing to hang on to places in their communities that were important to them. And June was a really good example of this, because she had a kind of one-person campaign really to kind of open up and make her local area a bit more dementia friendly. And she talked in particular about this cafe that she went to. I mean, I'm working on the toilets and that, but we'll get there. But they're just so dementia friendly, and the tables really spread apart, and it's open, light area. It's a carpet that doesn't do your head in. So what we were seeing here was really that it was people with dementia who were having the impact on changing their communities at a local level. Very often, like June, what they were doing was using disclosure of their diagnosis in order to say to people, you know, hello, I'm a service user, or I'm one of your customers, I've got dementia, what are you going to do about it, kind of thing. And this was leading to these really fruitful conversations with local providers and services and things like that. But another aspect of the learning that came out of our research that we hadn't anticipated actually was the importance of a kind of temporal time dimension to people's day-to-day lives. I mean, that wasn't something that we'd found in the research that we'd reviewed before we started the project, but it came through really clearly in our interviews, and not least in terms of the kind of friction and almost battleground of relationships with local providers and care providers. Because what we were finding, what people were telling us, was that cuts to funding for providers were being translated at the front line of care into limitations on the time that people were being given by providers. And those limitations are having a really starkly contrasting impact on the temporal experience of people with dementia compared to their care partners. So withdrawing support for people with dementia meant that they had a lot of time on their hands, but not necessarily time that was felt that it had much purpose to it or where they were meaningfully occupied. Whereas withdrawing the time of support for care partners really intensified the impact on the available time that they had and reduced their free time enormously. And what people were telling us was that they actually had very little say or control over these kind of timings, whether it was waiting lists or delays in decisions or how much time a home care worker arrived and each day, that kind of thing. There was very little say or wriggle room for people with dementia themselves. And I just wanted to share a couple of quotes with you from a couple that we interviewed, Sean and Francis, because for me, this really kind of underlines what is happening as a result of the cuts that are being made and the taking of time away from people. I mean, Sean was in a situation where his support had been whittled right down to a point where it had been fully removed. And the most important part of that support was a befriending service where somebody came and visited him and took him out and about from the home. So he lost that opportunity for accessing outdoor and public spaces. And then in another interview where his wife Frances joined us, she then spoke about the impact that the withdrawal of time was having on her, how it was kind of reducing her capacity to be part of that kind of give and take within social networks and support networks that she was part of. And what was particularly hard for her was not being able to be a grandmother to a newly arrived grandchild somewhere down in London. So I think what this really underlines is how access to public spaces and also social networks are being eroded by these cuts that are being made kind of incrementally over time. And I think it really raises some questions about whether providers themselves are on the same page about this whole agenda around dementia inclusion, because it really raises some questions about the logic of what they were doing here. So just coming on to reflect a little bit about what all of these insights actually mean. I think one of the things that we learned really early on was that this idea of a community or a neighborhood is something that's administratively defined. You know, the kind of neighborhood that your council decides when you get your bins emptied or provision of services, that had almost nothing to do with what we were talking about with people with dementia. What they were sharing with us was what we'd call a kind of a self-build project of a community or a neighborhood. So it was very personal to each of the people that we spoke to, and what they were doing was kind of building their own community based upon choices that they were making about places that they were going and the people that they wanted to keep connections with, but also the places that they were having to avoid, either because of very stigmatizing or inhospitable social experiences, or because the design meant that they were really inaccessible for them. But what was at the heart of this was this opportunity to really benefit from both the strong and the weak tides that were kind of widely distributed about the neighborhood. And this is why I would argue that social networks and access to open and outdoor spaces is such a key consideration for people living with dementia in the community. And just to end very briefly, out of that for us comes this kind of recommendation, or perhaps a slightly different way of thinking about things, based on this idea of a whole community approach to dementia inclusion. Because what we were seeing is that we need to be having a conversation beyond health and social care to include a whole array of different sectors, businesses and service providers, because these are the people that someone with dementia is in contact with on a day-to-day basis. And perhaps that raises a question about how we think about and who we think of as being our dementia workforce. Because there are all these people who are engaged in what we call small acts of social care, distributed around someone's community, who are making an enormous difference to people's lives. So maybe we need to be thinking of them as part of a dementia workforce. I think what was really clear was the value of really robust, preventative, early on support to people that enabled them to kind of push back at this shrinking world pressure that they were experiencing, and through that to really change a person's trajectory with dementia and the whole journey with the condition. We also think it's really obviously important that care providers are both aware and accountable to these two key issues of maintaining social networks and providing access to public and outdoor spaces. But I would argue as well, in recognizing the diversity of these different self-build neighborhoods, it's also maybe hopefully going to be a mechanism to think about how we start reducing some of the inequalities that we know are so entrenched in dementia care services at the moment. Okay, thank you.
Really great note to end on, Richard. And just a really great talk about the community approach to dementia inclusion and neighborhood inclusion for dementia. All right, everyone, it's time for kind of question time. So, we have a lot of questions in the chat, and feel free to keep adding them in. And I guess I'll start off by really opening it to all three of you on the theme of environments and the diversity of environments across the UK. Is something that all of you really touched on, whether they're physical natural environments, physical urban environments, social environments, whether it be the diversity of socioeconomic status of minority groups across the UK. I wonder if you have any reflections on how these different types of environments really impact the experience of dementia and the experience of community spaces. If you have any kind of specific experiences with urban versus rural, different socioeconomic groups and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I would begin by saying that I'm not sure how useful these kind of broad, very generalized labels are, like rural and urban and suburban, and because actually when you get into the nitty-gritty of individual places, you realize that what is rural counts for a huge variety of different kind of environments, but also very different relationships that people have with those in environments. So I mean, I would always suggest moving away from labels and actually dealing with real places as a starting point for some of this work around dementia communities.
More individualized approach, absolutely. Jane, do you have a similar perspective on the point about post-diagnostic support and the variation that you saw there?
Not so much on post-diagnostic support, but certainly if you think about in the social prescribing context, access to organizations that provide activities or groups or things that social prescribers might actively prescribe to, then there's a huge disparity between what's available if you live and I'm going to slightly disagree with Richard, if you live in the urban environment than if you live in the rural environment. And certainly your access to those facilities is completely changed depending on where you live. So it actually does directly impact on how both the social prescriber and the recipient of the social prescribing, in this case dementia, can actually perform that dance around what it is that they want to do. So because I think certainly there are far more community groups that are accessible in a lot of urban areas than there are in the rural areas, and I think that's a huge thing. The multicultural aspect is also massive in this particular field, and the stigma and associated with dementia particularly really affects how those people in particular engage with any activities or any services for dementia. I think that's really important.
Yeah. Thanks, Jane. Yeah, on that point about stigma, I mean, I think what Richard was saying about what stigma associated with the shrinking world, as he put it, about avoidance and social discomfort, you might refer to as a self-stigma. But Joe Burns also had a question about stigma from the other side. Was there any data on acquaintances or friends of people living with dementia who stepped back at all as a result of this similar stigma?
Hugely. Our work with people with dementia says, and their supporters suggest that they refrain from interacting with lots and lots of different people because for the supporters, they're particularly worried that the person with dementia is going to have some difficult behaviours that are going to be exhibited in public. They don't know how they're going to deal with them. They're really anxious about what will happen in that scenario, and so they avoid them. So there's huge stigma attached to that. I suppose one of the interesting observations I'll make from some other work I'm doing is that children don't seem to be affected by that stigma in anywhere near the same way. So if there's children involved in that social interaction in the place, then the person with dementia and their closest supporter will often feel more comfortable about it because the children kind of dissipate the situation. And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, the social awareness and social interaction there is very interesting. Richard, do you have a comment on that point about stigma among friends and acquaintances and family?
Well, just really to echo what Jane was saying. I mean, we were really struck by how widespread it was. Even people encountering it in healthcare situations with the GP kind of talking over someone to talk to their partner and that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, it translated in just in having less contact and less time spent, and really around people withdrawing, right at a point where you would think this is where people need to rally around and be a source of support. So it was having a really negative impact, I think, on people's situation.
Thanks. Just back, if I may, on that, rural urban question for Steve. Actually, there are all sorts of different types of outdoor environments, and I know you're aware of a variety of research around, different types of forests and fields and urban parks and that sort of thing. I wonder if you had any comment on different types of environments and their impact on the experience of dementia.
There's definitely what I found interesting. There's definitely appeal of water. So people often talk to coastal environments or rivers. Often came up where people really like being around. But yeah, often it was interesting. Some people just a local park and just sitting on the park bench could offer loads of benefits as well, rather than going to some exotic place and things. So that was quite interesting. I know I've read literature that says sometimes people who have perceived that green and blue spaces are accessible actually have quite higher quality of life for people with dementia. So just knowing it's there sometimes is actually quite beneficial.
Very interesting. Yeah, I'm maybe you all can tell by my accent, I'm not from this country, but I do live in London, and even in a huge city as this, there are just parks everywhere, and I just find it so lovely that there is outdoor space available. But I wonder if Steve, if you know, are there areas of the UK where, folks with dementia are living where outdoor space really isn't accessible?
Ooh, well, yeah, most of the people I spoke to, yeah, they did just go for walks in the local area, even some up in, some places you don't associate. I think most places could access people, either just the local towns walking around and things. It's just really about what they're used to. So when people know the local area, they go around it. And yeah, I think the main thing about place really is that social connections. Like when someone has family or friends that can go with people, they're happy to explore more. When they haven't got that, then you're really kind of just like more about where you're comfortable with in your local area, whether that is just like perhaps walking down the local town or in the parts you know. So really, it's about these social connections fit on top of the places that really influence where people go and what people can do.
Yeah, another theme I was sensing between the three of your presentations was around the interaction between activity and environment. My background is in engagement with the arts for dementia, and that is so focused on the activity itself. And in so many arts focused papers, the environment is sort of just sort of mentioned as an afterthought. But of course, with Steve's research and definitely with Richard's as well, the environment really plays this kind of big role. But of course, the activity within the environment is also really critical. So I just wonder if you had any comments about that balance of activity and environment, how they interact with each other.
It is difficult in this country with the weather. So we tried to organize one project in November. It was like in March time, and it was so cold that a lot of people didn't want to do it, and it's like having to cancel. So I guess one of the problems in this country is the weather's so unreliable. So when you try to organize some things outdoors, like can't put a span in the works, especially as we noticed that some people, may feel the cold more or different things. So yeah, I think that does make it difficult for, even though it is so beneficial and so many people do enjoy doing these activities, and we did things like art outside, one of our projects we were working with. So there's people do get real benefit of it, but yeah, there's real restrictions of accessing these places and the weather, of course.
I think thinking about social prescribing, one of the big issues with the place and the activity here is the accessibility of activities in place, because we're reliant on the community and voluntary sector often to deliver these particular activities, and then they are bound by health and safety and safeguarding and all of the other rules and regulations around this, and quite often that prevents then a huge barrier for the person with dementia to actually engaging in the place and the activity. And I always think that that's a huge shame, because the way people get around that is to say, well, you have to have your significant other with you. And people with dementia regularly say, but I don't want to do that. I want to be on my own. I want to be my own person. And at points at various points in the dementia journey, that is what they should be doing. That's perfectly okay. And I think, there is a great example for those of you who may or may not have come across him. There's a person with dementia called Peter Berry, and he has written a book about riding a penny farthing bike all around the UK and about his other cycling exploits. But cycling and finding routes and doing all these activities in a place are often seen as absolute no-nos for people with dementia, for all the rules and regulations that there are in place in society. That would be my thought.
Yeah, I mean, just to add what you were saying, Greg, about the kind of that relationship between the two. I think historically in dementia research, it's kind of divided itself into looking at the social experience of dementia or looking at people's engagement with an environment and things like design accessibility. And I guess I would, based on some of the insights that I shared from our research, I'd really make the case for needing to see these really as very interwoven, and not really able to disentangle one from the other, because they are so interrelated when it comes to people's day-to-day experiences, which is why ideas of place, I think, are a lot more helpful than ideas of environment alone.
And this is, of course, all being talked about in an environment of resource constraints and potential funding cuts. And I both, Jane and Richard really talked about that and in their own kind of ways. And really interesting about how its relationship to the temporal experience and the actual ways that we're spending our time in our environments, Richard. Can I circle back to this question of stigma? Because we had another couple of questions on that, Richard. One was about the influence of gender on, not necessarily stigma, but on the way that social mapping was done and potential stigma associated with that. Did you have any observations about gender with those social maps?
I mean, undoubtedly, it was a factor. I think what was more of a factor in terms of particularly the size and the variety of these social networks was whether somebody had a co-resident carer of either gender, but also just in terms of their sort of living situation. If you're living on your own, it had a big impact on people's connections with and the width and upkeep of those connections. I think it's a lot harder if you're living on your own with dementia to manage social networks and orchestrate them in the way that carers can in somebody's life. But that's not to deny the role of gender, because I would agree that it's a very important factor in terms of what people's taking on and the roles that they're playing within these situations.
I just have one more question here that is around that point about social withdrawal. I wonder how that interacts with Jane's observation that social prescribing is stretched, and there's not enough. Do we know if there are certain groups that are withdrawing more and less likely to engage with social prescribing, or is it a certain specific group that it has high demand for social prescribing versus the group that's withdrawing, or is that a connection too far?
That's a tricky one. I think it might be there are easier groups to work with in social prescribing than people with dementia. That's kind of a halfway house of an answer. But certainly there do appear to be more community and voluntary sector activities that are known about that are particularly focused on mental health issues, children and young people's particular mental health issues. Some of the long-term conditions type focus, like working on physical activity for diabetes, heart disease, etc. Some of those are definitely more furnished in their provision, and also probably slightly easier for social prescribers to work with in a way that they can easily facilitate and put them out into particular organizations, coming backwards and forwards. So I think the people with dementia group is a challenge, and I think that's probably why you see less people with dementia being helped by social prescribing. Does that help?
It does. Thanks very much. Yeah, we're to time now, and I really appreciate all our presenters. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Richard. Really interesting work you're doing. Thank you for your presentations and feedback with the questions. Thank you to everybody who tuned in as well. It's been a really lively chat and really exciting to see some connections made. Great questions. Yes, we will be in touch via email. There will be a recording available, slides will be made available. It'd be great if you could fill out our evaluation link. I think that will get you access to the slides. So do stay in touch, everyone, and thank you for participating in today's AgeNet webinar.
Thank you.